Before we begin this incredible story, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Hit that like button, share with your friends, and save this video for later. Your support allows us to bring you more incredible stories that will touch your heart and inspire your soul. Now let's begin our journey. The grand hall of the castle buzzed with excitement. Nobles in their finest attire clinked crystal glasses, their laughter echoing off ancient stone walls as they prepared for the evening's ceremony. The Duke himself stood tall among them, his presence commanding respect and fear in equal measure. For years, his word had been law in these lands, unchallenged and absolute. No one noticed her at first. She entered like a shadow might slip through a crack in the wall, silent and unassuming. Her simple dress bore the dust of long roads, her feet bare against the cold floor. The guards barely glanced her way, mistaking her for a servant girl who had lost her way, or perhaps a kitchen maid running late with her duties. But she didn't scurry toward the kitchens or bow her head in deference. Instead, she walked deliberately to the center of the hall, a place where no commoner had any right to stand, and stopped. Just stopped, as if waiting for something inevitable to unfold. It was the Duke who noticed her first. His eyes, sharp as a falcon's, caught the irregularity in his perfect evening. A peasant woman, standing where only nobility should tread. His conversation halted mid-sentence, and following his gaze, silence spread through the hall like ripples in still water. With elegant cruelty, he descended the steps toward her. Each footfall echoed with authority. His face wore the expression of a man who had never been defied, who expected nothing but immediate submission. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the silence. The woman offered no reply. She stood motionless, her eyes fixed on him with disturbing calm. Around them, servants exchanged nervous glances. Her silence was more than mere reticence. It was an act of defiance. The Duke's lips curled into a contemptuous smile. "The shadow seamstress," he called her mockingly, eliciting nervous laughter from the edges of the hall. "You don't belong here." But something unusual happened then. While the Duke's gaze had broken countless spirits before, the woman's eyes did not falter. They held steady, unflinching, as if she saw through his carefully constructed facade to something beneath, something he had long buried. A flicker of discomfort crossed his face, so brief that only the most observant would notice. But it was there, a momentary fracture in his perfect composure. "Who invited you?" he shouted, his voice slightly higher than before. The woman finally spoke, her voice soft, yet somehow filling every corner of the vast hall. "I was summoned by fate." More nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, but it quickly died away as she continued. "This hall once belonged to me, even if you never knew it." The Duke laughed, but there was a bitter, offended edge to it. "You're nothing but a miserable seamstress." She nodded slowly. "Yes, I am, and also something you never suspected." The atmosphere shifted. Whispers raced through the gathered nobility. Who was this woman who spoke with such certainty to the most powerful man in the kingdom? The answer would soon shake the very foundations upon which the Duke had built his reign. The crowd waited, suspended between disbelief and fascination. No one had ever challenged the Duke so openly within his own castle. His face darkened with each passing moment, rage building beneath his aristocratic features like a gathering storm. The nobles closest to him instinctively stepped back, recognizing the dangerous glint in his eyes that had preceded many a ruined reputation, or worse. "You speak of things you cannot know," the Duke declared, his voice carrying the practiced authority that had silenced countless opponents before her. "A seamstress should mind her needle, not matters of court." Several courtiers laughed obediently, though the sound rang hollow against the stone walls. The Duke took this as encouragement, circling the woman like a predator might stalk wounded prey. He gestured at her worn clothes, her calloused hands, the dust still clinging to her hem. "What could someone like you possibly know of this castle's affairs, of royal matters?" he sneered, playing to his audience. "Perhaps too many years breathing in fabric dyes has addled your senses." More nervous laughter rippled through the hall, but it died quickly when the woman made no move to defend herself or retreat. Instead, she reached into a hidden pocket of her dress with deliberate slowness. The guards tensed, hands moving to sword hilts, expecting a weapon. What she withdrew was small but proved more powerful than any blade could have been. A ribbon. Not just any ribbon, but one of deep blue silk, embroidered with the golden royal crest. Its rich color stood out starkly against her weathered hands, a fragment of nobility amidst poverty. The silk caught the light, its threads gleaming with a luster that even years tucked away had not diminished. "This ribbon was given to me when I was just a child," she said, her voice steady despite the hundreds of eyes upon her. She ran her fingers along the delicate embroidery, tracing the royal crest with the familiarity of someone who had examined it countless times. A gift from the Duchess, hidden from the world. The effect on the Duke was immediate and visceral. His composure cracked further as he stared at the royal token. Those close enough saw his face drain of color, saw his fingers tremble ever so slightly as he reached toward the ribbon before catching himself and withdrawing his hand. "Lies!" he shouted, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. There was an undertone of something else, fear perhaps, or recognition. A bead of sweat formed at his temple despite the hall's coolness. Everyone who had been at court long enough recognized that ribbon. It had been the Duchess's favorite, a signature accessory she was never seen without. The blue had perfectly matched her eyes, eyes that had once looked upon the court with kindness and wisdom, until the day she vanished without a trace. An elderly lady-in-waiting gasped audibly, her hands flying to her mouth. "The Duchess's ribbon," she whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I helped her maid sew the crest myself. There were only 3 made, one she wore, one kept in her jewelry box, and one—" Her voice trailed off, her eyes widening as she looked at the seamstress with new understanding. "I have never lied," the woman replied calmly, holding the ribbon as gently as one might cradle a wounded bird. "You simply never wanted to hear the truth." Murmurs spread through the hall like wildfire. Servants who had been with the household for decades exchanged meaningful glances. Elder nobles shuffled uncomfortably, recalling details they had chosen to forget. A retired chamberlain leaned heavily on his cane, his eyes never leaving the ribbon as if it were a ghost materialized from the past. "How did you come by this?" demanded the Duke, struggling to regain control of the situation. "This is theft of royal property, a crime punishable by—" "By what?" the woman interrupted, her quiet voice somehow cutting through his bluster. "By the same justice that was applied when the Duchess disappeared, that justice?" The Duke's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching visibly along his temple. The hall grew impossibly quiet, the tension thickening the air until it felt difficult to breathe. Over a decade had passed since that mysterious disappearance, a subject that had become forbidden within the castle walls. Even mentioning the Duchess's name in the Duke's presence was known to provoke his wrath. The woman's eyes swept the room, taking in every face, every reaction. "I grew up in the forgotten corridors of this castle," she continued, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality that held the audience captive. "Behind tapestries and curtains, I learned to sew and to listen. I became invisible to you all, just another pair of hands mending your clothes, fixing your tears, making you presentable." She took a step forward, the ribbon still displayed between her fingers. "But while I worked, I heard. Every dress I created for your nobles carried more than just silk and thread. It carried truths I silently collected." Her voice took on a hypnotic quality as she spoke of secrets overheard while she worked invisibly among them. Conspiracies whispered in darkened corners, blood pacts sealed away from prying eyes, broken promises exchanged over lavish feasts. The names she mentioned casually, precisely, made certain nobles blanch or step back into shadows. "Lord Harrington's mysterious new wealth after the border taxes went missing," she said, causing an elderly nobleman to choke on his wine. "Lady Ashford's midnight meetings with the ambassador from North Vale, while treaty papers disappeared from the royal study. A well-dressed woman in crimson silk suddenly found the floor fascinating to stare at. In these walls, I became the keeper of your shadows, the one who knew what happened when you thought no one was watching. The nobility grew restless. Some shifted away from neighbors who had been closest allies moments before. Others clutched their jewels as if suddenly afraid they might be taken. Trust, already a rare commodity in court, seemed to evaporate entirely. Who had spoken carelessly near this seamstress? What indiscretions had she witnessed while they dismissed her as merely part of the furnishings? But it was the Duke who seemed most affected. His usual commanding presence had diminished with each word she spoke. He remained rooted to the spot, unable to dismiss her as he would have any other commoner. The hand that had so confidently gestured before now hung limply at his side. "And then came that night," she said, her voice dropping so low that people leaned forward to hear. "The last night the Duchess was ever seen within these walls." The hall fell silent as a crypt. Even the servants froze in place, goblets half poured, trays suspended in mid-air. The master of ceremonies, who had been anxiously consulting his schedule for the evening's festivities, slowly closed his ledger. I was mending a tapestry in the eastern corridor. It was late, most had retired, but I heard it. A muffled scream, hurried footsteps, a man rushing from the Duchess's chambers with something clutched in his hands. Her eyes fixed on the Duke. "And then you, Your Grace, emerging shortly after. But there was something different about you, something on your hands that the darkness couldn't quite hide." The Duke's face contorted with rage and something else, the desperate expression of a man watching his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. His hand moved to the ornate dagger at his belt, then fell away as he remembered the witnesses surrounding them. "No one ever questioned where she went," the woman continued, her voice gaining strength rather than diminishing. "No one dared. The fear you inspire proved stronger than the search for truth. A duchess vanished, and the kingdom simply continued, as if she had never existed at all." She held the ribbon higher, letting it catch the light from the chandeliers above. "But objects remember, and people remember too, even when they pretend not to. This is slander," the Duke finally managed, his voice echoing through the hall. But there was a tremor in it that betrayed him. His eyes darted around, suddenly aware of how the court watched him, not with their usual deference, but with emerging doubt. An ancient butler, stooped with age and long service, stepped forward slightly from his position near the wall. His voice, when it came, wavered with age, but not with uncertainty. "The night Her Grace disappeared, I found bloodstains on the eastern staircase," he said. "I was told it was wine spilled during a late celebration. I knew it wasn't wine. Wine doesn't try to clean itself from the stones the way someone did that night." The mystery that had been deliberately forgotten for years had resurfaced, and with it, questions that had never been properly answered, questions about a beloved duchess who had simply disappeared one night, leaving everything behind. Questions that now hung in the air like a sword poised to fall. The tension in the grand hall had reached a breaking point. The Duke stood swaying slightly, his authority visibly diminishing with each passing moment. The woman, still standing in the same spot where she had first planted her bare feet, had not raised her voice once. She didn't need to, her words carried enough weight to crack the foundations of lies built over a decade. She looked directly into the Duke's eyes, a gaze so penetrating that several observers later claimed they could almost see the truth passing between them like a silent current. "I am the Duchess's daughter," she declared. The words hung in the air, impossible, and yet somehow inevitable. "Born of her union with a simple man who served wine at your castle feasts." The revelation exploded through the hall like silent lightning. Many nobles gasped audibly, their jewels rattling as hands flew to mouths in shock. Others laughed nervously, an instinctive reaction to disbelief. The more calculating members of court quickly began reassessing alliances and possibilities, their minds racing with the implications. "She hid me to protect me," the woman continued, her voice steady despite the chaos her words had unleashed. "From you." The Duke's face lost its remaining color. He attempted a dismissive laugh, but the sound died in his throat, emerging as little more than a choked gasp. Deep down, beyond the layers of power and pretense, he knew. He had always known there was a possibility. But he had buried that thought with the same cold efficiency with which he had buried all mention of the Duchess's name. An elderly nobleman stepped forward, peering at the woman's face as if seeing it for the first time. "By the gods," he whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "she has her eyes." And indeed, now that the possibility had been voiced, many began to see what had been in front of them all along. The same distinct shape of the eyes, The proud tilt of the chin, the graceful posture that seemed incongruous with her humble attire, features so reminiscent of the beloved Duchess that it seemed impossible they had not recognized them immediately. The crowd began to divide. Some nobles stepped subtly away from the Duke, creating physical distance as their loyalty wavered. Others moved closer to the woman, drawn by curiosity or perhaps a desire to align themselves with what might become a new power in the kingdom. A few remained frozen, calculating their best move in this unexpected upheaval. From the back of the hall, an aged serving woman pushed forward through the crowd. Her hands were gnarled from decades of service, her back bent with the weight of secrets carried too long. "It's true," she cried, tears streaming down her weathered face. "The Duchess told me her child lived. She made me swear to keep the secret, said that one day her daughter would return when it was safe." The old woman fell to her knees before the seamstress. "I never thought I'd live to see this day." The Duke had not moved. He stood as if turned to stone, watching as the perfect world he had constructed began to disintegrate around him. His reign, built on fear and silence, was being dismantled by a single voice speaking truths long suppressed. More servants came forward, offering fragments of corroboration. A stable hand who remembered strange midnight rides the Duchess would take to the forest's edge. A kitchen maid who had prepared extra food that disappeared mysteriously. A guard who had been instructed to look the other way at certain times, never asking questions if he wished to keep his position. Small pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered deliberately were now coming together, forming a picture the Duke had tried desperately to prevent anyone from seeing. Throughout it all, the woman remained composed, her bare feet planted firmly on the stone floor, as if she had finally found her rightful place after years of wandering. There was no triumph in her expression, no vengeful satisfaction, only the quiet determination of someone who had carried truth for too long in silence. Then, with deliberate slowness, she reached into the lining of her dress. The movement caused several guards to step forward, but they halted when they saw what she withdrew. Not a weapon, but a folded document, creased and yellowed with age, but intact. Most importantly, it bore an unbroken seal, the personal seal of the Duchess. This testament was written by the Duchess 3 days before her disappearance, the woman announced, holding the document aloft so all could see the unbroken seal. She entrusted it to the servant who raised me, to be presented when the time was right. An elderly royal counselor, one of the few court officials whose reputation for integrity remained unblemished through the years, stepped forward at a nod from the woman. With trembling hands, he accepted the document, examined the seal carefully, and then broke it open. The hall held its collective breath as his eyes scanned the contents. The counselor's expression shifted from skepticism to astonishment, and finally to a grave solemnity. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with tears. "It is authentic," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of decades of loyal service. "This is indeed the Duchess's hand and her personal seal." He turned to face the assembled court, the document held before him like a shield of truth. "I shall read the Duchess's final testament." The Duke made a strangled noise of protest, but it was drowned out as the counselor began to read in a clear, unwavering voice that seemed to grow stronger with each word. "I, Duchess Eleanor of Westmoreland, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare that I have a daughter, born of my love for Adrian Cole, a man of humble birth but noble heart. Should any harm come to me, let it be known that my child has claim to my name, my heritage, and the truth of my life. She is to be protected from those who would deny her existence, and one day she shall know the home that was rightfully hers from birth." The counselor paused, looking directly at the Duke before reading the final line. "And let those who have lived by silence finally face the voice of truth." The crowd erupted in murmurs and exclamations. The document's words were unambiguous, their implications devastating to the Duke's carefully maintained narrative. The official recognition of the Duchess's daughter, the woman who now stood before them in a peasant's dress but with a royal's bearing, could not be denied or dismissed. The truth had finally emerged from the shadows, as unstoppable as the dawn after the longest night. The grand hall of the castle, once the symbol of the Duke's unassailable power, had become the theatre of his undoing. As the last words of the Duchess's testament echoed through the vast chamber, The Duke staggered backward as if physically struck. His legs, which had stood firm through wars and rebellions, now betrayed him. He collapsed into his iron-forged throne, a seat that had always amplified his authority, but now seemed to swallow him whole. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, now appeared vacant and distant. For decades, he had ruled without question or challenge. His word had been law, his displeasure a death sentence in all but name. The nobility had bent to his will out of fear, the common folk out of helplessness. Now a woman in a dust-stained dress, a seamstress he had attempted to humiliate, had unraveled his carefully constructed realm of lies with nothing more than truth as her weapon. The Duke's hands trembled as they gripped the ornate armrests of his throne. Those closest to him could see beads of sweat forming on his brow, despite the hall's coolness. He attempted to speak, to reassert control over the situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his grasp, but each time he opened his mouth, no words came forth. It was as if the weight of his secrets had finally crushed his voice. Several of his most loyal nobles, men and women who had prospered under his rule and turned blind eyes to his methods, made tentative moves toward him, sensing perhaps that their own fortunes were tied to his. But they halted mid-step, caught between old allegiances and the new reality unfolding before them. The calculation was visible on their faces. Was it wiser to stand by a falling tyrant, or to distance themselves while they still could? In the center of the hall, the woman, now revealed as the Duchess's daughter, stood exactly where she had first appeared. She had not moved to claim the throne or demand retribution. Her purpose had never been to seize power, but to speak truth to it. And in that moment, as the Duke withered under the weight of exposed secrets, the true nature of power in the realm was being redefined before everyone's eyes. "I have witnessed enough deaths in shadows," she said, breaking the heavy silence. "I did not come here seeking another." Her words sent ripples of surprise through the assembly. Many had expected, perhaps even hoped for, a dramatic call for the Duke's execution. The bloodthirsty anticipated justice in its most primal form. But the woman offered something different, something that many of those present had never considered: accountability without vengeance. "For years this court has existed in the darkness of willful ignorance," she continued, addressing not just the Duke but everyone present. Noble lords who asked no questions when a duchess vanished, ladies who stopped speaking a name rather than demand answers, counselors who advised silence instead of truth. You all built this silence together brick by brick until it became a prison for your own honor. Several nobles lowered their eyes, unable to meet her gaze. Others straightened their backs, perhaps feeling the first stirrings of something long forgotten, conscience or the remembrance of principles once held dear before ambition and fear corrupted them. An elderly baroness stepped forward, her jeweled fingers trembling as she lowered herself in a deep formal curtsy before the seamstress. "We failed your mother," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "And in doing so, we failed ourselves and everything this kingdom once stood for." Like a dam breaking, others began to follow, first a few, then dozens. Nobles who had sneered at the seamstress minutes earlier now bowed or curtsied before her, not out of fear of a new power, but out of respect for the courage it had taken to stand alone against a lifetime of orchestrated silence. Through it all, the Duke remained slumped in his throne, watching as his court transferred their allegiance not to a new ruler, but to a new ideal, the notion that truth, no matter how difficult or dangerous, must be honored. When the woman finally turned to leave, a young lord called out, "Will you not take your rightful place? The throne could be yours by your mother's blood." She paused, turning back to face the assembly. Many held their breath, anticipating yet another shift in the realm's future, but she merely shook her head. "I did not come for a throne," she replied. "Crowns and castles mean little to me. I came for my mother's memory and for the truth she deserved. Nothing more." With those words, she began walking toward the great doors through which she had entered. No one moved to stop her. The guards who hours earlier might have seized her at the Duke's command now stepped aside, some inclining their heads in respect as she passed. As she reached the threshold, the Duke finally found his voice. "Wait," he called, the single word echoing hollowly through the hall. "What happens now?" The woman turned one last time. "That," she said, is for you and this court to decide. Your story continues tomorrow, with or without me. The only difference is that now it must be written in truth, not shadows." And with that, she was gone, leaving behind a hall full of people confronting questions they had spent years avoiding, and a duke facing the ruins of a reign built on sand. In the days that followed, the kingdom experienced a transformation unlike any in living memory. It wasn't marked by violence or upheaval. There were no executions, no bloody coups, no marching armies. Instead, the revolution that swept through the realm was one of whispers turned to open speech, of questions finally asked aloud, of truths acknowledged after years of denial. The Duke remained technically in his position, but his authority had been irrevocably diminished. He moved through the castle like a ghost, avoided by those who had once scrambled for his favor. Some said he spent hours staring at the portrait of the Duchess that had been rehung in the main gallery after years of storage in a forgotten cellar. Others claimed to hear him talking to it late at night, though none could say whether he sought forgiveness or offered explanations. The name of the seamstress, the Duchess's daughter, spread through the kingdom like wildfire. In taverns and markets, on farms and fishing boats, people spoke of the heiress of truth, who had confronted a duke with nothing but words and changed the course of the realm. Ballads were composed, stories elaborated and passed from village to village. She faced him with empty hands, they would say, and left him with empty power. The tales grew in the telling. Some claimed she had magical abilities, that she could see the truth hidden in men's hearts. Others insisted she was blessed by ancient gods, sent to restore balance to a land long tilted toward darkness. The more pragmatic said she was simply a woman who refused to be silenced, and in a realm accustomed to silence, that alone was magic enough. 3 weeks after her appearance at the castle, a traveler spotted her in a small village near the eastern forests. She was doing what she had always done, sewing, repairing garments for local farmers, listening to their stories with the same attentiveness she had once given to the whispered secrets of nobles. A group of villagers, upon learning who she was, fell to their knees before her. She immediately bade them rise. "I am still a seamstress," she told them. "The truth didn't change that, nor should it change how you stand in this world. Straight back and eye to eye is how people should meet one another, regardless of birth or station." Word of this encounter spread, adding yet another layer to her growing legend. She became known not just for speaking truth to power, but for rejecting the very hierarchies that power had established. In her simple insistence on remaining a working woman despite her royal blood, she offered the kingdom a new model of dignity, one not dependent on titles or wealth. Meanwhile, in villages and towns throughout the realm, something remarkable began to happen. People started speaking more openly, questioning authority when it seemed to contradict truth or justice. Petty local tyrants who had ruled through intimidation found their power base eroding as communities discovered their collective voice. If the seamstress could face a duke, they reasoned, surely we can face a corrupt tax collector or an unjust magistrate. It wasn't always easy. Old habits of deference and fear died hard, but slowly, steadily, the kingdom began to straighten its back, to look authority in the eye rather than at the ground. The woman herself continued her simple life, moving from village to village as work demanded. She declined countless invitations to return to the castle, to take up residence as a recognized royal, to claim lands or titles that might have been hers by right. Her refusal became as much a part of her legend as her confrontation with the Duke. Her power isn't in a title, people would say. It's in showing us that we all have voices worth hearing. 6 months after her appearance at the castle, on the anniversary of the Duchess's disappearance, something unprecedented occurred. Villages throughout the kingdom held candlelight vigils in memory of the lost Duchess, not in secret as some had done in years past, but openly in village squares and town centers. The Duke, for the first time in his reign, did not attempt to suppress these gatherings. Instead, it was announced that the castle itself would observe a day of remembrance. Many whispered that this was the final victory of the seamstress, forcing a public acknowledgement of the very woman the Duke had tried to erase from memory. Others saw it as the beginning of the Duke's attempt at redemption, however late and insufficient it might be. The seamstress herself attended none of these ceremonies. She was seen that day in a small cemetery on the outskirts of a forest village, placing wildflowers on a modest grave, that of the servant woman who had raised her in secret, who had preserved the Duchess's testament until the time was right, who had died just weeks before the seamstress made her fateful journey to the castle. A child from the village, too young to understand the significance of the famous visitor, approached her at the graveside. "Were you very sad when she died?" the child asked, pointing to the grave. The seamstress nodded. "Yes," she replied, "but she left me with something precious, her courage. She taught me that speaking the truth, even when it's dangerous, is the greatest form of love one can show to the world." The child considered this. "Is that why you made the scary duke afraid? Because you loved the world?" The seamstress smiled, a rare, genuine smile that few had seen. "Not to make him afraid," she corrected gently, "to make everyone else unafraid." This exchange, overheard and retold, became perhaps the most enduring part of her legend. Throughout the kingdom, parents began telling their children the story of the seamstress, who taught a realm to be unafraid, who showed that the mightiest weapon against tyranny was not a sword or an army, but the simple, persistent voice of truth. And in the years that followed, whenever someone stood alone against power, whenever someone spoke an uncomfortable truth despite the consequences, people would nod and whisper, "The seamstress's courage lives on." The kingdom would never be the same, not because she had sought to change it, but because in being uncompromisingly herself, she had shown everyone else that they could be uncompromisingly themselves as well. Her legacy wasn't written in royal decrees or carved in statues, but in the straightened backs and raised voices of people who had discovered that silence was a choice, not an obligation. And perhaps that was the most powerful revolution of all. Were you touched by this message? Like it now, subscribe to the channel and share it. Someone needs it today, and that click could change everything.